Tradition is sometimes something we're born into, like a holiday meal or a Sunday routine. Other times, it's something we create without even realizing it, and we only realize it retrospectively. At the time of this recording, Easter is just behind us, and it got me thinking about traditions in the first place. In this video, I'm sharing what we can learn from our grandmothers to make cooking simpler, why learning new things today is maybe harder than it was, and how to avoid the overwhelm, plus a few practical tips for sourdough baking if you're just starting out or just thinking about doing it. Now, sourdough babka, which is what I'm making here, isn't really traditional in Slovenia. Here, everyone makes potica, which is a sweet yeasted walnut roll, similar to how you'd make cinnamon rolls, but you bake it as a roll and not as individual rolls, if that makes sense. And since both of my grandmothers make it, and my mother makes it, and even my mother-in-law makes it, I honestly didn't see the point of making potica myself. It's kind of their thing, something they're really proud of, especially the grandmothers. And I never wanted to step into that territory. So instead, I decided to make babka for Easter. And of course, I made it sourdough because that's just what I love. The reason for that is that babka is something we genuinely enjoy, although it's not the, traditional thing to do. It's kind of our tradition now. When I first made it a couple of years ago, I actually used yeast. I made a few yeasted babkas over the years just because those were the recipes I found at the time. This was before 2020, back when sourdough wasn't as popular yet. But this time I wanted to turn the recipe into a sourdough version. And for me, anything that's a sweet bake feels pretty straightforward. I have a sourdough brioche dough that's my go-to, and I use it for everything. Donuts, cinnamon rolls, collages, buchtelen. Basically, if it's a sweet bake, I use this same dough. I know that some recipes online will adjust the dough slightly depending on whether you're making donuts or cinnamon rolls or babka, but for me, those variations make such a small difference in the final result that I prefer to just simplify and stick to my one brioche dough. It makes baking easier because I know the dough by heart, I know exactly how it should feel and when it's ready. So for this babka, I used my go-to sourdough brioche. I have the recipe for it on my blog, stretchandfolds.com, and I'll make sure to leave it in the description if you want to print it out for yourself. And I know I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but I really believe this is the key to sourdough baking, and honestly, to baking and cooking from scratch in general. Learning one thing, getting really comfortable with it, perfecting it so it takes the mental effort out of it, and that's how you add another thing to your repertoire of skills and you can move on to the next thing. And skills oftentimes kind of stack onto one another. So, for example, if you're already very familiar with sourdough, you'll probably have an easier time learning how to make sauerkraut because the basics of fermentation are already something you understand. I'm lucky because this is how I learned to cook. When I was little, my parents had jobs, so I spent a lot of time with my grandmother who was babysitting me. Every day, me and my sister would help prepare her lunch, and she had this style of cooking where she didn't know 100 different recipes, but she knew a few basic principles really, really well. So she could cook anything within her style without much thinking because it was all built on the same foundations. And that's what I try to carry over into how I cook and bake today. And I noticed that when I want to learn something new these days, it can get overwhelming so quickly. There's the whole internet at your fingertips, and everyone does things a little differently. So you're often left wondering which recipe or which person to even follow. That's why I think it's really important to remember when you're learning something new, it's going to be messy. You probably won't get it right on the first try, and that's okay. But if you're learning how to cook from scratch in general, I can see how overwhelming it could feel today. Honestly, I think learning to cook now is a lot harder than just growing up with it, like I did partially. But there are still so many things I needed to learn, and probably every week there's something new I'm excited about and want to try for myself. So I'm still very familiar with how learning looks today. On one side, you have all the information you could ever want, and on the other side, you probably have too much. So, what helps is just picking a few people you trust, maybe one for sourdough, another for fermenting, another for canning, and stripping things down to the foundations they talk about so you can start to implement them for yourself. And then, the most important part, don't get hung up on every little detail. Once you understand the basics, the best thing you can do is practice. And through practice, you'll see where your actual problems are, and then you can go research more specific advice. For example, if you keep bumping into the same problem every time you shape dough, then you go look into that particular issue. It doesn't really help to try and read everything up front and expect perfect result because you probably won't get one. But that's normal. Everything has a learning curve. Everything will be messy at first, and at some point you will perfect it. We have a tradition of painting Easter eggs on the Friday before Easter. I remember loving the brightly colored eggs all throughout my childhood. But as I've become more aware of what's actually in those paints, even the ones marketed as natural, I find myself learning more and more towards the onion dyed eggs. Of course, my kids love the bright colors, who could blame them, just like I did. So we strike a balance, about half and half, and that way everyone is happy. Here I'm about to show you one of the recipes I have very clear memories of making with my grandmother. I've adjusted the process just a little bit, just based on how we like to eat them, tradition, but make it your own. If you've ever made apple strudel or anything where you scratch the dough really thin, this is kind of a variation of that idea. It's basically like apple strudel, just with a different filling. And instead of baking, you just roll them up and boil them. Okay, so this is the dough after mixing. It should be really elastic, really pliable. If you're mixing by hand, this is the kind of structure to go after. It should almost be like a Play-Doh. It's very fun to work with. So at this point, we are going to let it rest for about, I usually try to do 1 hour, but I'm usually also in a hurry, so 30 minutes is enough. But if you can do 1 hour, that's even more ideal. And you can put it in the fridge at this point as well and continue with this later, maybe tomorrow. And since we are going to only leave it to rest for 30 minutes, it's okay to just let it rest here on the table. But if you are going to put it in the fridge, you should cover it with something, maybe an oiled plastic wrap or something like that, so it doesn't dry out. The traditional way of making them, and it's still how my grandmother does it, is by stretching the dough over a floured tablecloth. This makes rolling so much easier later because when you're ready, you just lift the cloth and the roll almost rolls by itself. So if you want that perfect roll, you'll want to use a floured tablecloth. Okay, so this goes for any dough out there, but with doughs that you need to stretch really thinly, and we have a lot of those doughs in our culture, it really helps to stretch the dough a bit, then go do something else for 3 to 5 minutes, let's say, come back and then stretch it some more. Because what rest does, it relaxes the gluten bonds. And when the gluten bonds relax, the dough is more prone to stretch better when you stretch it next time. So the way to go with those things for me is to start stretching it, go do something else for 3 to 5 minutes, come back again, stretch it again a little bit, and then I repeat that, and in half an hour or something like that, I have the dough that's stretched really thinly. So that's my advice for any kind of dough that needs to be either rolled really thinly or stretched really thinly. We like our Štruklji a bit more rustic, more like an apple strudel, if you will. So not perfectly rolled, but nice and thin. And I think there are two camps when it comes to Štruklji or apple strudel. One camp likes that neat, perfect roll, but for that you can't really stretch the dough as thin. And we're in the other camp, as you might have guessed. We like the dough as thin as possible, even if it means the roll isn't perfect. For the filling, I use a Quark cheese mixture. I have a full recipe of Štruklji on my blog, and I'll link it down below. I also wanted to quickly talk about the cheese we use. So, in my country, we have a fresh cheese called skuta, and we use it for so many dishes. I've already shown a few here on my channel, actually. The thing that always surprises me, though, is that when you try to translate skuta, whether you ask Google or ChatGPT, it usually says cottage cheese. But cottage cheese is really different. When I studied abroad in the UK, I bought cottage cheese thinking it would be the same, and it wasn't. It was saltier, the texture was different, it just wasn't the same at all. What I eventually learned is that Quark is actually a much better substitute. Quark feels almost exactly like Skuta, just a little smoother. Skuta still has some tiny curds in it, while Quark is more blended, if that makes sense. So if you do try this recipe, definitely use Quark, not cottage cheese. And just a tip, if you're looking at Austrian or Italian recipes and Google suggests swapping in cottage cheese for fresh cheese, be careful about that. Cottage cheese usually isn't the right replacement for a lot of the fresh cheeses we use here in this part of Europe. So, skuta and substitutes aside, for this recipe you'll want to use quark, a little bit of sour cream, 1 or 2 eggs, and a little bit of sugar. You can adjust the amounts based on the consistency. I usually buy local skuta, which means sometimes it's more runny, sometimes it's more firm, so you just have to work with what you have. What you're aiming for is a filling that's nicely spreadable because we're working with a very thin, fragile dough. I usually need to help myself roll it up with a bench scraper, as you saw, and that gets the job done every time. One of the great things about traditional dishes, and I mean traditional based on where you live, not necessarily your ethnicity or religion, is that they usually fit the place really well. I find that here in Slovenia, our traditional recipes mostly use ingredients that are locally available, in season, or easy to grow in a home garden. And even if you're not growing them yourself, you can usually find good deals with those ingredients when they are in season. So I would really encourage you, even if you've moved to a different part of the world, to get to know the traditional dishes where you live now. Because ingredient wise, they're usually simple, local, and much more affordable. Štruklji are not traditional, in my opinion, if there's no buttery breadcrumbs on top. You'll see me using the buttery breadcrumbs on top of the next dish I'll show you as well, and for good reason. They are really, really good. I've never seen this in American recipes, but here in Europe, toasted buttery breadcrumbs are really popular. I remember having them in Paris, and I know they're common in Austria too. And if you're from the US and never made them before, definitely give them a try. They're so simple to make and absolutely worth it. I like using my homemade sourdough breadcrumbs, but you can use whatever breadcrumbs you have on hand. The trick is to toast them in plenty of butter, add a little sugar, and make sure there's still some melted butter left around the breadcrumbs when you're done. You don't want them to soak up all the butter. Some people like to add honey instead of sugar, so you can go either way. And it's really just a few minutes of work, and then you can spoon them over Štruklji and make them even better. While I love tradition most of the time, there are definitely moments where I feel like there's room for improvement. And traditional gardening is one of them. I grew up gardening the traditional way, so like my grandmother did it. You pick a patch of grass, turn it into a garden, plant your vegetables, pull weeds a few times a week, and water everything once or twice a day, usually just with a simple watering can. It's very straightforward and very simple. But my perspective shifted a little when my sister got a raised bed for her cherry tomatoes last year. She set up a drip watering system and barely had to water by hand at all. She also had almost no weeds because supposedly she used fresh soil in the bed. Recently, I was researching raised beds more seriously, and I listened to a great podcast episode of Jill Winger's podcast, Old Fashioned on Purpose, when she had a gardener on to really dive into whether raised beds are worth it. And spoiler alert, they definitely are. I think it's probably too late for me to change everything this year, but next year I'm seriously considering a full garden makeover with a few raised beds. And I'd honestly love to hear your experience if you started with a traditional garden and switched to raised beds. Were you happy with that? Was it worth it? Please let me know in the comments because hearing real experiences helps me so much and it motivates me a bit to change things. And also, if you want more information about raised beds, I definitely recommend checking out that podcast episode. I don't remember from the top of my head how it's called, but I'll make sure to link it down below. So I'm boiling some potatoes, a bunch of potatoes actually, because I'm making potato dumplings. They're great because the main ingredient is potatoes, which we almost always have on hand. And the only thing you need to add to form a dough is a bit of flour, a few eggs, and some salt. And that's it, and you have the dough. And then for the filling, you can do whatever you prefer. I'm going the traditional route, so I will be using dried plum and some sugar, but you can totally use jam, chocolate, anything really, depending on what kind of dumplings you want. I do have a recipe for tzmoki on my blog as well, but there's a little caveat with those. The dough really depends on what kind of potatoes you use. So different potatoes will give you slightly different doughs, so the consistency can vary quite a bit. So this clip just reminded me to mention that you'll want to use a lot of flour on your work surface when making tzmoki. This time my bag of flour actually tore open, as you saw, so I didn't have any problems with having enough flour on the table. That problem kind of solved itself. Anyways, in the recipe for tzmoki, I listed the minimum amount of flour you'll definitely need. But don't panic if the dough gets really sticky and you have to add a lot more. You'll see me adding quite a bit of extra flour in the process, and that's completely normal, especially when you're rolling the dough out. I feel like it just gets increasingly sticky if you don't add flour. Unfortunately, I somehow misplaced the footage of me showing how I squished the potatoes for this dough, but basically I just used a potato ricer. I know IKEA sells them here in Europe and it's one of those kitchen gadgets that I actually use all the time. It really comes in handy anytime you need the potatoes not just mashed but really squished, so like gnocchi or any kind of potato-based dough. The traditional filling for tzmoki here is really simple. Just one plum, either fresh or dried, and a cube of sugar inside each dumpling. Since we don't stock sugar in form of cubes anymore, I just add about a teaspoon or two of sugar instead, but you can add however much you like. And if you have some dried plums sitting around, maybe they've gotten a bit hard over time or you bought a batch that's tougher than you expected, this is a great way to use them because when we boil the dumplings, the plums soften up and turn almost a little bit mushy inside the dumpling. It's the perfect way to rescue those harder dried plums you might not want to snack on anymore. And of course, these dumplings, much like Štruklji, aren't done until you top them with some buttery toasted breadcrumbs. Even though it's beautiful to honor the traditions we were given, I think it's just as important to start a few of our own, because it's the simple things we choose to do again and again, even if they seem silly or small, those are the things our children will remember, and I often think about that now. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you subscribed. I'll be back next Friday with more sourdough baking, simple food from scratch and natural living. Bye!